Good evening. Did you hear the big news? That's right. Prince Harry is engaged. And now we'll be witnessing royalty until there's a wedding, a baby, a ship to be dedicated, or a polo game. And the world will be caught up with the magic and the excitement and the thrill. What would it be like to be the king, the queen, the prince, or the princess? To have unlimited resources, all the power and prestige, to be known throughout the world, to have your face on the screen and every decision, every move be photographed and spread all over. To have countless people under your authority and be able to snap your fingers and give them instructions and all the money you could ever want. No job to go to every day. Just flip from place to place. And I'm not sure that all the members of the British royal family even have last names. Wouldn't that be easier to keep up with? Tonight we're going to think about Solomon's search. And hear one who was the CEO of Israel, who had everything that a man could want. Having asked for wisdom, he received much more as God gave him riches and honor and splendor and territory and a name that would be known all over. And Ecclesiastes records Solomon's determination to test and try and prod and probe and see if he could find something that really makes it work, that fills the heart, stimulates the desire to get up and face every day and make the most of it and make it count. And we learn through his quest what we see reflected again and again and again throughout history. That apart from God, all is vanity and futility and emptiness and chasing after wind, but you never quite catch it. I learned just the other day that the CEO of Amazon is the first person in the world to be worth $100 billion with a B. Wouldn't that be the life? To have it all, to be able to do it all, to be able to spend it all. A few weeks back, Will Brown came and asked if I would meet for dinner with the college group after a while tonight. I always say yes to that. And then talk with the boys about how God makes a man. And the message to Solomon to us that success is not what the world says it is. God defines it. And the sooner we recognize that to fear God and keep His commandments, that's the whole thing, then we can enjoy every blessing of this life. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. It's a gift of God. Food, drink, friends, fun, travel, sports, nature, fishing and hunting and golfing, and whatever it may be. But under the sun, without seeing past the horizontal level, we'll never find anything that fills this God-shaped hole that God has created within each of us. You've heard the old analogy that one may climb to the top of the ladder only to discover that he leaned it against the wrong wall. And all the effort and all the strain and all the energy that were put forth have not taken him where he thought he ought to be. And so we start with the ladder first by looking at the end before we place the beginning. We want to know where we're going before we ever start. And I must say, I think that's what Will has done in working with our college young people. We've always had fine young men and women. But I think Will came to us and he saw something that he could do, that he could encourage, that he could build, that he could grow. And Will, we just appreciate you so much for that. With each of us, that niche, that spot, that role that God has given us, the sooner we discover it. I think that's one of the messages of Ecclesiastes, and that's the reason that the college age, the younger the better when we first grasp this, because the sooner we plant the ladder in the right place, the farther we can go, and the higher we can reach, and the more we can see and do for the Lord. And so the book of Ecclesiastes closes basically by saying, don't wait, don't put it off while you have your strength and your vigor and these opportunities before you. Seize them. Speaking of ladders, do you climb yours to clean your gutters? And how many times do you have to put the ladder somewhere different before you get to the clog? I have developed a tool. It's going to be patented. Don't tell anyone. You promise? I have a long PVC pipe, and I put a mirror on the end of it. I can stand on the ground, I can walk alongside underneath the gutter, and I can see the clog. You won't tell, will you? Then I have another tool. I've taken my blower, my leaf blower, and I put an extension on it and a U-shaped plastic piece. I can blow out the gutters from the ground. Isn't that impressive? Don't you want one of those? See me afterwards, and I'll try to set you up. But the fact is, as long as I stay on the ground, I'll never see from that higher vantage point what's only visible from that spot. In the book that Will lent me, that the college-age young men are following, How God Makes Men, I found this so interesting that we can have so many blessings and yet still have a sense that something is missing, that meaning and fulfillment can be elusive. But then he writes, God's plan is to use that sense of frustration as a tool to chisel you into the person He wants you to be. God makes men by making it impossible for us to find lasting happiness in any pursuit apart from Him. That is powerful. That's the truth. Perhaps God made this world, and with all the decisions we can make and all the alternatives, we could try this, that's not it. Try this, that's not it. Try this, that's not it. And then finally, when God is at the center, we can say, that's it. Did you ever wonder why God introduced Adam to all the animals before He made Eve? Can't you see in the Garden of Eden one passing by and Adam says, no, not. Definitely that won't work. And then God puts him to sleep, takes his rib and makes a woman, and what does Adam say? Wow, that's it. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. They've gotten a little bit smaller since this one. And people said, you failed 1,000 times before you finally got it right. He said, no, there were 1,000 steps to success. And in Ecclesiastes and in some of our difficult experiences in life, we're going through these steps. That's vanity, that's futility, that's striving after wind. That won't fill the bucket, the heart that God has given me, so that we might cry out to Him. And there are those in the world that just keep trying the same old things with the same old results. And they are the ones who might be receptive and ready to our sharing the gospel with them. because they've been running in circles, going faster and faster on the treadmill, not getting anywhere. And then here's a solution. Here's something that will outlast us, something that provides meaning and significance and a foundation for living. Well, as we look to 1 Kings, if you would turn there, starting in chapter 3, we'll summarize what leads up to the message of Ecclesiastes by seeing first that God said, what would you request of all the things you could choose? An understanding heart. I'm young. I'm inexperienced. These are your people. They deserve the very best. I'm not up to the task. God said, because you've requested such, I'll give you much more. You'll defeat your enemies. Your fame will spread. There'll be riches and honor for you. But if you look at chapter 3:14, there's a condition attached. And it has to do with Solomon continuing to walk in the way that God has given him. Keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. And something we realize right off is that just having wisdom doesn't guarantee that we'll always exercise it. We could lose it. We could turn from it. The rest of the chapter, here are these two women arguing over which one is the mother of the surviving child. And you remember the classic execution of Solomon's newfound wisdom when he offers to split the child with a sword and thereby identifies the true mother. Look at chapter 4 and be overwhelmed. You talk about the cabinet. Here are the names, here are the positions. People on the payroll, people in the administration, people who help carry out Solomon's wishes. And then his power, verses 20 and 21. Judah and Israel, numerous as the sand on the seashore. That was the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Eating and drinking and rejoicing. The kingdoms from the river, that's the Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines and the border of Egypt. And all these other peoples brought tribute to Solomon and served him all the days of his life. He could not count his money. Beginning at verse 22, notice just for one day what it required in terms of the menu. How would you like to be the head chef preparing for Solomon and those that were with him? Verse 27, deputies, each came in his month. Nothing was lacking. Starting in 29, his knowledge of botany and biology, of singing and poetry and proverbs. When I read verse 31, I see names of people that we know nothing about. But in that time, these were the really sharp minds. Ethan, Heman, Calcol, Darda, and so forth. And by comparison, we see that Solomon far surpassed them. 3,000 proverbs, 1,005 songs. He could talk about all the trees, all the animals, all the birds, all the creeping things and fish. And so people would come from all over to learn from him. His was a household name. Well, the temple is built. And Solomon's palace, splendid, magnificent. I was noticing how much effort he put into that which he built. How, as some would say, he spared no expense. Even though 1 Kings puts the most emphasis on the temple rather than his house, Solomon indulged himself, taking 13 years on his palace, almost twice as long as the temple. The inventory of his building enterprise is impressive. Its extravagance, widely known. In fact, if you were to read of his own house, Then the forest of Lebanon, the hall of pillars, the hall of judgment, 2 other courts, one for him and one for his Egyptian wife, fortifications around Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and whole cities like Gezer, Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, Tadmor, storage cities or encampment for chariots and cavalry. And you read about his navy and his import-export business. And God reminds him. Look at chapter 9. This is a second appearance, as previously when the Lord asked him what he would request. I've heard your prayer, the dedication of the temple. I've consecrated this house, put my name there. Look at verse 4. As for you, if you'll walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I've commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. Just as I promised your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons indeed turn away from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I've set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I'll cut off Israel. And people will ask, how did this happen? And the answer will be, because they forsook the Lord their God. Solomon not only had wisdom, he had warnings, and they were dire and severe and specific and clear. The Queen of Sheba, also called the Queen of the South, comes and inquires of him. And she says, the half was not even told me of all the skill and ability and knowledge that the Lord has given you. As chapter 10 goes on, his wealth and splendor and wisdom. Look at verse 14, all the gold. Look at the traders, the kings of the Arabs, the governors of the country. Verse 16, the large shields of beaten gold, 200 shekels of gold on each shield. And you can go down the list. There was nothing like it. Look at verse 20, end of the verse. Nothing like it was made for any other kingdom. Drinking vessels of gold, the ships at sea. He became greater, verse 23, than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. The whole earth was seeking his presence to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart. They brought every man his gift, silver, gold, garments, weapons, spices, horses, mules, and so much year by year. Verse 26, 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities, made silver as common as stones. His import of horses, verse 28, and selling those horses. A chariot brought in from Egypt and then sending it out with other merchandise to the various lands. If anyone ever had it all, royalty, unlimited treasure chest. People all around him who would do his bidding no matter what. He can build anything he wants. He can own whatever he likes. He can employ, he can engage, he can interact with the greatest quote-unquote people of the world. And so chapter 11 has that surprise. Even though God had spoken to him specifically, and going farther back than that, Deuteronomy 17, Moses was inspired to write, when you have a king, he's not to multiply wives for himself. And the rest of the Old Testament shows that forecast of Deuteronomy sadly being fulfilled, and so the exile, and then the return home. Solomon loved foreign women. The very nations, look at verse 2 of chapter 11, you're not to associate with them. Quoting Deuteronomy 17:17, they'll turn your heart away. 700 wives, princesses, 300 concubines. Reminds me of the little boy in Bible class asking the teacher, is it true that Solomon had 300 porcupines. Anything his heart desired, without limit, without prohibition. If he wanted it, he took it. He made it his own. And his heart was turned away to other gods. Gods honored by those foreign women who did not know Yahweh and serve Him alone. And so God raised up adversaries, and eventually the kingdom would be torn apart, and Jeroboam, the servant of Solomon, would take over the majority of the tribes, and Solomon's son Rehoboam would be left with so little in the south called Judah. Solomon made a turn. With all he had been given, all he'd been shown, all that was before him, he made a decision to abandon that wisdom and guidance, to set his sights on his own pleasure, his own will, his own way. And then Kings says he died. And that's the rest of the story from 1 Kings. When we come to Ecclesiastes, which by the way means the preacher, Ecclesiastes is the Greek word. You know the word ecclesia, church. Ecclesiastes is the church person, the preacher, so to speak. In Hebrew, it's kohelet. It's an oddity that our Bibles, even books written in Hebrew in the Old Testament, often have names that are taken from Greek, and that's the case. The book of Ecclesiastes, this preacher is using the life of Solomon. Solomon perhaps writing himself, because in Ecclesiastes it says, I was king in Jerusalem. And so definitely speaking from that position. And yet the search in Ecclesiastes and its outcome, we don't see in Kings. In Kings we see, he started at the top, had it all, turned away because he married outside of God's will in several powerful ways. Ecclesiastes then shows how Solomon in his wisdom looked for something that would make life work. And it's the same quest going on all around us. And as we see in Ecclesiastes 2, if you'll turn there, those elements that were part of his trial, we can look at the newspaper, we can go online, we can talk with our children about the fact that they too will be tempted to seek this or that. Because there are those who do, who haven't learned the lesson of Ecclesiastes. And so Solomon says, I'm going to use my wisdom, and I'm going to try, chapter 2, pleasure and laughter. Have a good time. Pleasure, excitement, ecstasy. I want to have fun. Nothing wrong with that. Fun, that is. If it's wholesome and right in the sight of God. But as an end in itself, it leads to futility and a dead end. Because the more one has, the more he or she wants, and the more empty that person becomes. Then he said in chapter 2 and verse 3, how can I stimulate my body with wine while my mind was still guiding me wisely? Perhaps the intent is there not, let me just try some of this. They said this alcohol is good stuff. I wonder if I'd feel better. I wonder if I could escape. I wonder if life would just work the way it's supposed to. I'm going to stay sober, someone will say. Let me just dabble in strong drink and see if there's something there I've been missing. What a message that is for those of every age. And then he said, I tried folly. I just thought maybe take some risks, maybe go on the wild side, maybe step over the fence, maybe bend the rules, maybe do something really, really dumb. And then if I could get away with it, I'd say, hey, I'm something, I'm a success. Oh, and houses, vineyards, gardens. Who did Solomon build them for? For myself. Parks, fruit trees, irrigation ponds. In my study, I noted that this was a land in which there was no connection with a water supply, with a river, nor was it abundant in rain. And so the building of aqueducts and the use of techniques to bring water where it was needed, that was considered quite an accomplishment. And for Solomon to have all the water which you and I may easily take for granted was an accomplishment that would be the envy of all the world around him, so that he could irrigate the fruit trees, everything green, lush. You talk about landscaping. Boy, if I just had the best landscaping. And people would walk by and say, wow, that person's really somebody. Look what he built. And then there were slaves, some perhaps taken as captives of war. It's fascinating. Kings tells us that Solomon conscripted laborers, and those he subjugated, he would put them to work building these extravagant and elaborate projects. And then those born within, perhaps to those, others would come and they would be part of his workforce. Flocks and herds. Can you imagine having the largest ranch, the healthiest animals, the greatest supply of meat? I also learned in my study that the common everyday people didn't get to eat meat. They survived on grains and vegetables and things that they could grow. And so to be able to put meat on the table was a sign of extreme wealth. And we've already seen his retinue, all those that would come to his table and eat until they were full. Oh, he collected silver and gold and royal treasure. And I'll see on the screen how gold is the answer. And then the next message will be, no, it's silver. And I'll witness those who amass great fortunes, those whose names are known, those who come up with things that dazzle the world and make them prominent and important. And I'm thinking, if that's done just for self, for vainglory, for pride and ego, that person is going to end up at the top of the ladder on the wrong wall. And they may not ever realize it, because they may leave this life thinking that's all there is, that's what it's about, until they stand before God. And so I want us to teach our children and our grandchildren and those coming up through school and those starting out to work, that all that God has given, everything God made is good. And with God filling the heart, each aspect finds its place. Solomon notes musical entertainment and how that has swept our culture and our world. The latest band, the latest singer, the latest group. And Solomon could call in anybody he wanted, I'm sure, and they would perform for him. Pleasure. the women. Solomon didn't realize that the true joy of romantic love comes from faithfulness to one person, with the trust and security and openness and bond that will result from such a commitment. We live in a time in which Ecclesiastes is being acted out all around us. And unless we learn from errors that others have committed and mistakes they've made, it's often said that we're doomed to repeat them. Solomon's problem. We've talked about his position. We've talked about his opportunities, his experiment. What's his problem? His problem is he keeps coming up against the wrong wall, hitting his head into the bricks and saying, that's not it. I'm running faster, but I'm still not getting anywhere. I'm going in circles. And getting more and more and more of that is not going to provide meaning and purpose and a genuine, fulfilling, and happy life. Have you ever heard of Frank Lloyd Wright? He's been called the greatest American architect of all time. And there in the Shoals in Alabama, Tanya and I, on a recent visit last year, went to the Frank Lloyd Wright house that's there. His name known everywhere. People would seek him out. He was so important that the house there in Alabama, he didn't actually come to build. He used others who were underneath him and called upon them instead. He was the pioneer of the Prairie School movement of architecture. He designed more than 1,000 structures. His creative period spanned more than 70 years. Wright designed original and innovative offices, church buildings, schools, skyscrapers, hotels, museums, and other structures. He designed interior elements, including furniture and stained glass. And in his houses, he would choose the furniture that would go in each house because it was going to bear his name and represent him. But what also made the headlines often was his colorful personal life. He left his first wife, Catherine Lee Kitty Tobin, for a woman named Cheney. Then that tempestuous marriage ended in divorce, the second wife, and then he began a relationship with another woman and finally married her in 1928. There were murders at his estate in 1914. Was he a success? Did he accomplish his goals? Did he reach the top of the ladder? He might have said, at least in this life, not the life to come, yes, I had a plan, I had a dream, I had an architect's drawing, a blueprint for what I wanted to be and to do and where I wanted to go and what I wanted to have, and I have attained it. You and I look not only at his life, but at our own. And we realize anything but God, that's not it. And you know these words as well as I from the end of Ecclesiastes. When all's been heard and said and done, fear God, keep His commandments. This is it. And there's a reason. God will bring every act to judgment. Everything that's hidden. We were talking about this morning. We exposed, whether good or evil. That's it. Eureka is a Greek word that means, I have found it. When a person comes to Jesus Christ, perhaps having experimented, having experienced, having tried this, that, and the other, that's not it. That person comes to Christ and says, Eureka, I found it. Have you found it? Have you committed yourself to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? You talk about royalty. The one who is sovereign and rules over all creation, and whom we will meet on that great day. And so tonight, if you would step forward and indicate what questions you have about the Word of God, how you might get past the frustration and the angst, the issues of life, to know real peace and joy and fulfillment. If we tonight could help you be baptized into Christ, if we could pray with you, we'd love to be part of your journey and your search. Won't you come? Let's stand and sing.